seeing our network expanding, it's something that inspires me deeply to continue and to learn more and find other ways to think about law and be a lawyer. My name is Nina. I'm a cis white Brazilian woman. I am a young lawyer and I've been connected to the anti-torture field since the beginning of my bachelor in law. Well, to answer this first question, I'll have to start by saying that the Brazilian context is defined by structural violations of human rights. These dynamics shapes our society, our accessibility, subjectivity, and institutional relations. We have a very long dictatorship in Brazil. It lasts 21 years. During this period, the structural human rights violations that are present in the Brazilian history since the beginning, since the colonization process, were re-articulated in this authoritarian dictatorship. A large part of the population was victimized. The police, for example, continues to act in a very racist and classist way, and as well different political organizations that were fighting against the dictatorship were also repressed. The repression was something that marked really profoundly our society. Our dictatorship had a very soft end, so the transition to democracy didn't really create an accountability of the perpetrations of human rights violations. So we have this inheritance of our dictatorship that's combined with our slavery past that creates a very authoritarian culture and very militarized culture in Brazil nowadays. I believe that being a human rights lawyer in Brazil means not relying on the justice system to promote justice, but trying to use it strategically, based on mobilizations built in conjunction with universities, social movements, and civil society in general. Thinking about human rights law in Brazil necessarily means thinking about the law from a racially informed perspective in conjunction with gender, class, sexuality, territory, religion, among other markers. Understanding the challenge posed by the fact that the institutions that are supposed to guarantee rights are the ones that very often violate them, human rights law tends to suffer from gaps produced by the state in disputes over the guarantee of rights, which has a direct repercussions both in the internal dynamics of procedural disputes and on the activation of public policies aimed to promoting rights. As a result of the legacy of slavery that still affects the present, combined with military dictatorship with an unfinished transition, state institutions operate, as a rule, from a racist, classist, and cis-heteropatriarchy logics, increasingly militarized and punitive. The institutions of the justice system and other fundamental instruments for access to justice are fragile and still insufficient, and this has a profound impact on the field of human rights law. This terrifying scenario, of course, also generates overload and pressure in the process of conducting cases. In addition, waves of ultra-right-wing hatred are frequently directed against civil society organizations, spreading fake news, misrepresenting the work produced by these organizations. Brazil has a terrifying scenario of violence against human rights defenders. And just like all the other forms of violence that are perpetrated here, the level of risk to which people are exposed is informed by racial dimensions imbricated with gender, class, territory, among other social markers. The state is the main perpetrator of torture in Brazil. Since slavery, as Tula Pires and Malu Stanque remind us, torture has been used against Black and indigenous populations in Brazil. This is evident, for example, when you look for the Brazilian prison system, where more than 800,000 people are subjected to inhumane conditions. Another example of torture is the one carried out by security forces against Black youth living in favelas and Brazilian peripheries during police operations and police approaches. There are countless national and international reports on this issue. In this context, it's very important to highlight sexual torture carried out by state agents against women and LGBTQ plus people. An emblematic case of the struggle for justice and reparations against sexual torture and police lethality is Favela Nova Brasília case. The central issue of the case is the lack of an adequate response to the sexual torture and massacres carried out by Rio de Janeiro state police officers in Favela Nova Brasília on 1994 and 1995. The victims and the victims' families, with the support of civil society organizations, CEGIL and ISER, successfully brought a case before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which condemns the Brazilian state. In this the condemnatory sentence, the EA court states that the two massacres are part of the structural context of police violence in Rio de Janeiro, highlighting that police lethality is brutally unequally distributed and in terms of race and class, predominantly affecting youth, Black and poor and unarmed people. However, I think it's very important to highlight that the vast majority of cases of sexual torture in the Brazilian cities still remains outside the official records. It's a chain of legitimization of violence that goes from the police through the judiciary. For over three years, I was a member of the State Committee on Torture Prevention, a collegiate body that is part of the Torture Prevention Policy. The committee and the entire prevention policy is a result of the optional protocol to the United Nations Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Brazil is signatory of these instruments, and according to it, the country is obliged to create autonomous and effective monitoring mechanisms. One example of our networked approach to this work came after reports that young women detained in juvenile detention centers were suffering for sexual violence from detention center officers. Through interinstitutional efforts, we led an articulation in favor of the approval of legislation that guarantees that only female agents can work in female detention centers, which was finally approved. This whole process was mobilized by the committee together with the mechanism, with a lot of involvement from the movements of people deprived of their liberty who are part of the prevention policy. In the same direction, to address and confront sexual torture perpetrated by agents of the state in places of deprivation of liberty, the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro Student Research Group on Inter-American Human Rights System, of which I am a member of the coordination team, prepared and sent an amicus curiae brief to the Inter-American Courts of Human Rights on a college case, in which one of the women victims of the dictatorship suffered torture while pregnant as well at the time of her delivery. In the document, we analyzed the specific context of violence perpetrated by the Brazilian state against mothers, puerperal, and pregnant women deprived of their liberty in the dictatorial context. This effort seeks to demonstrate that the imprisonments and torture perpetrated were not an isolated event, but part of a context of generalized and systematic violence against women implemented by the military dictatorship in Brazil. In the amicus curiae brief, we also characterized this sort of state violence as a gender, reproductive, and obstetric violence, in order to make it possible to recognize and redress the specificities of the torture perpetrated against mothers and pregnant women during the dictatorship. And we demonstrated the connections between the violations in the case and the torture experienced by non-white pregnant women deprived of their liberty today. I believe that human rights law is at an important moment of discussion and reconfiguration. The fight against torture is absolutely linked to the policy to decarcerate and defund the police. And increasing the state penal structure, as we see happening in Brazil, is counter to the fight against torture. And this agenda is a major challenge. There are many difficulties, but the network that acts collectively in this field is very inspiring, and this renews our energy and motivates us even in the most adverse scenarios. Without doubt, being a part of groups like Rio de Janeiro State Front for Decarceration and the National Agenda for Decarceration inspires me very deeply. One of the moments that I'm most proud of was building the Warriors for Decarceration training cycles as a coordinator of the program of Rights and Justice at ISER. The initiative seeks to build a political pedagogic project based on the methodology of popular legal education. It takes the form of legal political training cycles with family members of people deprived of their liberty, based on partnerships with social movements fighting against mass incarceration and other forms of state violence. In partnerships with two social movements, AMUG and AMAR, we carry out 3 training cycles to support and strengthen the collective struggle of these political organizations. I'm deeply inspired by the network of joint mobilization that was formed through this process. And I think this is a project that I'm very, very fond of.